Yeah, and good afternoon if you're in the UK, and probably good morning if you're in the US, and if you're still joining us from that side of the world, and good evening if you're lucky enough to be in Australia or on that side of the world. So obviously we're really chuffed to invite everyone join us today for No More Weeks Tech Conference. This is our 8th session of the day, and we've been blessed to have been able to speak to a number of speakers from different parts of the world. And we started in Australia this morning, we moved across to India, and we've had a chat with the team across the African continent. And then we've obviously had a really great conversation now with different agencies and NGOs working out of the US and UK. But I think one of the things that sort of resonated throughout today is that there are obviously different forms of online abuse and online harm. And whilst many of our conversations have brought forward very similar experiences of intimate partner abuse or from intimate image abuse, there is something about us really recognizing the tools that are being used. And so I'm really delighted to introduce Madeline and Janensky, who is a research fellow with the Gender and Tech team at UCL, and Jennifer Reed, who is head of policy at the University College of London and is based within the science, technology, engineering and public policy teams. They have an incredible piece of research they're going to talk to us about, but actually they're really going to drill into that space around what is the Internet of Things. With all things technology, we start to use terms very flippantly, and they are great because they collectively describe something, but also can feel quite isolating unless we know what they are. So part of today's conversation will be really about drilling down on some of those terms and names. And so if you have questions or answers, pop them in the Q&A box. There may be things that we talk about today that could trigger feelings and that you may need support. In the Q&A, there'll be the resource of the Global Directory. So now wherever you are in the world, No More's Global Directory will be able to point you to specialist domestic abuse and sexual violence services, and people are ready to help and support. So I'm going to start by allowing Jen and Maddie really to talk about their work that they've been doing, and in particular their piece of research. But before we do that, can we just take a moment to really unpick what the Internet of Things really is? What does it mean? What does it define? And how important it is? Because I know this has been central to your research in a way of being able to name what these items are. I know you're sitting together, so it's easier to say. You go first.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to kick that off. Essentially, what we mean by the Internet of Things and Internet of Things devices, as they're more broadly known, is an umbrella term for devices which used to be offline, so kind of doorbells, blinds, light bulbs, fridges, kettles, watches, things which had no connectivity, as it were, and were quite manual and dumb, I think some people like to use that term, and have become smart. So essentially have become connected to the internet in some way. So in the same way that we all used to have kind of analog watches or normal doorbells, we now have smart video doorbells. We now have Apple Watches with location tracking, with all sorts of data being collected on the individual and much more enhanced functionality. And what that's essentially done is increase the risk factor that women and girls particularly, and our focus on women who are facing domestic abuse and domestic violence situations that they are facing, because perpetrators of domestic abuse are taking advantage of this smart connectivity, this new functionality that devices have, and using that as a new kind of tool or weapon in how they can exert abuse or control or harassment, intimidation. So the actual crime that's being committed, often by the perpetrator, is not new. The actual patterns of behaviour that we see in terms of controlling coercive behaviours, intimidation, stalking, they've been around for some time. But the smart upgrade of a lot of our kind of functional everyday kit, the things which we took for granted so many years ago, is enabling those perpetrators to have extended reach in how they actually commit those crimes. So it's more about how it's opened up a whole new world to individuals who are minded to commit such crimes anyway, and given them new weapons through which they can deliver that abuse, essentially. And I'm happy to kind of build on some examples of how that comes up. But that really is what we mean by the Internet of Things, and why it's so important. And it's often because they are everyday objects, such as doorbells and other things we've talked about, overlooked, I think it's fair to say. They're so everyday, we're so used to them now, they're such a kind of fabric of everyday life, that a lot of the activity which we would kind of call out and say is clearly abusive has almost been normalized. So tracking your partner's location and knowing where they are at every move, looking at their calls, checking their phone when they're not looking, these kind of things are, we would argue, part of a pattern of abuse, but it can also escalate into much more kind of suffocating situations, and extreme situations with dire kind of consequences. So the role of IoT cannot be overstated enough, and I think some of the examples we'll probably build on during that session will bring that to life and help build the story of what that means. But that's what IoT is, and hopefully that umbrella term is not too broad to depict it.
No, I thank you so much for that. And I think you're right. There is something about, like, we've moved into this space where technology is consistently being created to make our lives easier. And we are, in most instances, we really welcome it. In many instances, we think, great, it will make us a little bit more safer. And we may choose to share bits of information and control with partners in the beginning of relationships, or if we feel safe at a moment. And that can, change. And I'm hoping we can get through talking a little bit of that a bit later. Shall we start with your research, which is incredibly interesting, and probably, in this moment where the world is now focusing, in a sense, which is great, on online harm and abuse, you guys are at the forefront of this piece of work in sort of unpicking the Internet of Things and the items that are being used. And it's really great to hear about your research in its early stages.
Yeah, could I do an intro and pass over to you for the detail? Would that be okay? So just in terms of the context, Maddie's the brains behind the operation of which is going to talk to you about today in terms of the update on our research and what it means in terms of the game-changing approach that it's going to have for how we define and therefore tackle tech abuse. But just for the kind of broader intro and rooting of who we are and why we care about this, we've been active as the Gender and Tech group at UCL since 2018 and publishing since then on IoT and what it means in terms, or Internet of Things, sorry, and what it means in terms of the risk vector and how it's surfacing abusive behaviours within the context of domestic abuse and domestic violence since then. So around 6 years ago. And if we look back at some of those earlier publications from 2018, we were really saying then the Internet of Things is coming. It's not widespread yet, but this is going to become a part of the fabric of everyday life. We need to take action now in terms of how we build in protections for women and girls to ensure that these tools and gadgets can't be manipulated or repurposed and used as weapons against them. Since then, particularly due to the pandemic, we've seen a complete explosion of Internet of Things devices, and the research has become even more prevalent, and the problem has not gone away. We've seen some kind of acceptance and general recognition, actually tech abuse is surfacing in such a way, but there's still quite a disconnect in terms of recognizing the problem and understanding what we do about it. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that we have no proper definitions. Quantification of tech abuse is difficult because it's not defined properly. It's not captured adequately within crime statistics. And a lot of partners, including policy partners, if we can't evidence it and we don't have the data to say how much of a problem it is and how it's emerging and how it's occurring, it makes it very difficult to act or to evidence why you should be acting in a certain way. And that's one of the things we're seeking to tackle, which Maddie's going to expand upon. But it's within a broader umbrella of our work, which is looking at what we can do to prevent perpetrator behaviour. We've just launched a new 4-year project looking at perpetrator activity and how we can understand whether tech triggers their behaviour or is just an enabler, and what we can do to work with perpetrators to prevent tech abuse from taking place. And also looking at the response to tech abuse, so particularly working with the criminal justice organisations and police forces within the United Kingdom to see how we can respond better to tech abuse when it is happening. So our group is IoT and its kind of origins, as it were, but we're now much broader, looking at the kind of intersections between gender and tech and society, as this is a much broader problem and it requires that kind of more holistic solution. But we will not get to that solution without understanding what on earth it is, which is where Maddie comes in.
Yeah, like Jen mentioned, a big problem of, we look at many different aspects in our team, and one of them is okay, we understand there's a problem with IoT abuse and tech abuse, and how can we measure it? Well, it's hard to measure something if you don't know exactly what you're trying to say. Okay, this is it. And so to try and capture what is it? So like Joe mentioned, the definitional aspect of it is that we wanted to not just work within our team and think, okay, how can we define it? How can we think of how are all of these devices, like many of the ones that Jen mentioned earlier, how are they being used to perpetrate this abuse and this, in some aspects of looking at specifically at the domestic abuse, how are these being used? And I think what we wanted to do is kind of go to other experts in the field and say, well, this is what we think. What do you think? What are the aspects that are important to you to be able to capture properly? And so one of the current projects myself and a couple of others in the team are working on is something called a Delphi study. And for those unfamiliar with the method, it's the idea that you go with questions to a field of experts, to specifically subject experts in this, and say, okay, well, what do you think about this? What is important to remember with this? And through a couple of rounds of study, the idea is that you get closer and closer to a kind of specific agreement and consensus and definition. So what we've done with that is taken these different aspects of this definition of IoT abuse and said, okay, well, what kind of terminology do you think is best? Because if you're trying to find research, and not just from an academic perspective, if you're trying to be aware of what people are looking at and what actually is happening in these areas, there's so many different terms being used that it's sometimes hard to try and capture the best item, or best is the wrong term to use there, but try to capture all of the research you're trying to, or try and capture how this is actually impacting real people when you're unaware of some parts of it. And similarly with Jen kind of mentioned as well, the measurements is that how are we able to properly tackle this if we don't know what we're able to measure and to keep track of this? And I think as well, what we've done is to try and use this study to capture the opinions of experts, but I think it is important to mention, we haven't just gone to academics to do this, because we are as you mentioned, we're in UCL, we are in an academic setting, but we're not the only people looking in this area of research. We're also not the only people that are aware that it matters. A lot of people, as you can see from today, a lot of people think this is important. And so we've gone to people who work within government, people who work in non-governmental sectors and in the third sector, but also we've gone to people who work in industry to capture, okay, what do you think is important? And we've also gone to people around the world. And I think this is something that's kind of a big thing, a project we're working on at the moment, where a good chunk of the way through trying to properly capture, okay, which are the items that different experts feel are important for us to capture in this, and what are maybe things that we haven't realized or other experts haven't realized that actually this is something that is an aspect that we have not captured so far. And that is currently where we are within this project.
Thank you so much for that. It's incredibly interesting, and it's like you say, it's absolutely needed. I know from the survivors, and when they speak about it, they'll often say that to get, to have professionals and those outside of the domestic abuse, sexual violence advocacy sector to believe them is already a challenge, to get their friends and their family members to believe them. But then to introduce that something is happening and they can't necessarily pinpoint it because there's something in the home that's doing it, often can seem even more difficult for a friend or family member or professional to believe. So I think, that piece around going to the third sector and hearing the lived experiences of survivors and being able to really allow that to shine through, because what we hear all the time, what we've heard throughout today, is that we can't keep up to date with the changes and the advancements in technology, and as a frontline practitioner or advocate, to be able to respond effectively, you need to be in a way ahead of the developments of that technology, but also at the same time thinking about how it can be misused inappropriately. And often a lot of our learning will come from providing support around a specific situation or response, and how do we share that across our sector, and how do we make sure that other survivors benefit from that? But it's really intriguing, it's really interesting to know that you're doing this. In particular, I think we've spent quite a lot of time today, and rightly so, speaking about the survivor experience, but probably not enough time talking about the people who choose to abuse and why they choose to do it. And like you say so willingly, is that technology is another tool in their toolbox, and it's something that it becomes incredibly difficult for people to respond to in some ways. a door ring bell, you wouldn't necessarily think that someone's, using it for maliciously, but actually is incredibly useful for those who are trying to control someone's whereabouts. Sort of in a way, moving on to that, I think, we talk about this Internet of Things. You've mentioned heating, you mentioned the doorbell, but there are lots of items that exist now in our homes. Can we just have a little bit of a discussion about what some of those items are? Because we all have them. And when we think about them, perhaps we're not always understanding the other side of it, and it'll help us respond effectively if a friend or family member said something.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall I?
Yeah.
Completely. These items are everywhere, and they're often hidden. If I give some kind of specific examples, it might help bring to life where those risk vectors are. We've also got a mocked up diagram, essentially, of a living room, which is one of our policy briefings, which shows how these kind of IoT devices or gadgets can kind of sit within the home that can be abused. Within some of the examples that I'm going to give, just to kind of set the context, one of the reasons that these IoT gadgets can be abused in such a way is that whilst they've been upgraded and are smart, they tend to have in common that they haven't got privacy at the kind of forefront, and they don't have high security settings. So because a smart light bulb, for example, is just a smart light bulb, how you're going to kind of secure that setting and make sure that there's proper security and it can't be hacked was not at the kind of forefront of the design. The same with a lot of the other kind of routine objects that you might have. And that means they're really easy to be taken advantage of. So if we look at some earlier versions of video doorbells, for example, there was nothing typically on there, which would mean that if the perpetrator had added numerous other cameras that they'd put on that network around the home, so hidden cameras in bedrooms so that they could stalk the individual, watch them while they're out, monitor them throughout the day unawares, that user would not necessarily get a notification to say that 5 or 6 new cameras had been added to the network, because they are not the main person who has access to the account for whichever doorbell platform they may be using. There's no notification to every user on that system to say a change has been made within these settings that you should be aware of. And what we tend to see fairly regularly is that the gender imbalance around understanding functionality of the kit tends to be relatively skewed. So the perpetrator often tends to be the individual who has bought the device, installed the device, understands the settings, is the only one with access to the settings, has kind of more of an enhanced understanding of what the functionality is, and they use that to their advantage. So how that might play out in the home, we've had numerous instances of what we refer to as digital gaslighting. So we've had individuals who've been able to sit outside the home, and the woman or partner is inside the home, whacking the heating up to make them think they're losing their mind. Continuously, every time they turn it off, it's being remotely, to full volume. I've turned this off 10 times. Why is it going on? I'm losing my mind. Opening and shutting smart blinds to make you think that someone is watching you, that kind of intimidation and fear. Blasting music through loudspeakers when they're at work, they're not even in the house, every hour, on the hour. Remember that I am here, I'm not physically in the home, but I'm watching you, I'm thinking of you, this is how I'm kind of mentally manipulating you. All of these ways that we use the phrase digital gaslight, as I say, but essentially make the individual feel completely suffocated and as if they are being continually watched, continually harassed. There is no escape. If you're going to attempt to leave the home to get help, I will see you on the doorbell. I'll know if you've gone out. I will get the alert. I will come and I will intercept you before you can get help. I'm looking at your location when you're on the school run. Why did you stay still for 3 minutes at the school gate? Who were you talking to? Why are you seeking help? So where there may have been avenues previously where people could have raised the alarm or sought support from people, the world gets a lot smaller. And that's what this makes really difficult. We see quite a lot of instances on phones of stalkerware or spyware, which has been downloaded unbeknownst to the individual. So you could be watching all of the text messages, phone calls that they're making, and then the individual will play that back. I know that you've been contacting this person. How do you know that? I just know. And you've got no idea that they're watching all of your kind of messages, all of your calls, all of your emails. They can see all of your activity. So again, then if you're trying to kind of seek support from people, they can tailor it. So that's where these instances tend to be kind of surfacing, and the impact that it can have on the individual, which is often that you begin to question your own mentality. It's incredibly suffocating, and that makes it even more difficult when you're trying to get help, because saying to someone, he's watching me through the doorbell if I try and do anything, arguably we've heard people reply and go, well, it's his doorbell and he lives there, so what's wrong with, and I'm using he flippantly here to bring to life the subject. This could work both ways. What's wrong with that necessarily? It's a hard thing to particularly demonstrate to people when that individual who also lives in the home has every right to look at video footage of his own front door, or to ring and check in on you halfway through the day. What if he's just concerned? It's because it's such everyday kit and everyday activities that it makes it quite hard often for victim survivors to articulate why this is such an issue when they're trying to seek help. And they're not going to often come over and say, I'm a victim of tech abuse, or he's doing X to me or doing Y to me. Often they won't know. You won't know if stalkerware is downloaded on your phone, or there is a fear factor that's played in based on that enhanced functionality that the individual has who's committing the abuse. So we've seen really extreme circumstances where a victim survivor had become convinced by her abuser that the smart vacuum cleaner had knives inside, and if she tried to seek help, he would activate it and she would be attacked physically in the home, even when he wasn't there. And if you've been mentally controlled for so long, these are the kind of fears that you can really kind of have built up. Similarly, we see, I've got friends on the dark web. I understand how all of this works. If you try and get help, if you try and leave, I will always be able to track you down. There's always a way that I'll find you. You can't go anywhere. You have a digital footprint everywhere. I know how that world works. So I will find you. Actually, in some instances, we've seen that happen. So we've seen instances where people have hacked IP addresses, or recently used addresses where they know passwords to certain apps to locate people in certain refuges so that they can track them down. We've seen a number of instances recently where AirTags have been placed in children's belongings during visitation orders so that they can track back to the refuge and find the individual. So the vector is not just limited to the home. These smart devices and IoT devices go way beyond our front door now. But quite often within your own home network, there's a presumption that all of the users on the same network trust each other. And actually, that's where this biggest issue comes in, because you're not alerted to changes and you don't always have control over what those devices are doing. And if there was more security within the home network, some of these issues could be prevented.
I mean, I think, thank you so much for sharing so much. It's completely eye-opening. And I think, one of the things that we think is how we help somebody who's enduring domestic abuse is looking for those moments in their day-to-day lives to provide that support. And when we start to think that actually that wall's getting tighter and tighter and tighter, those opportunities become less and less and less. And if they, and you said it so eloquently in the fact that, this whole pattern is to become as disbelieving as possible. So if they were to report to somebody, it seems incredible that somebody would believe that their vacuum cleaner had knives in it, but actually when the immense amount of power and control and the coercive behavior and it's completely rational, and in that moment that's what the perpetrator wants. And so it's incredibly interesting. I think one of the misconceptions to some degree is that how expensive these items are and how difficult they are to get. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think kind of this idea that it's kind of twofold. I think if you're thinking about, okay, well, is it getting easier or simpler to be able to perpetrate these things? I think on one hand, no, because it's not that people who are perpetrating this are finding new ways to manipulate this technology and becoming these kind of, they're not taking these things and taking them into something that they're not meant to be, if that makes sense. I think on one hand, it is kind of getting simpler because a lot of the things we're seeing, a lot of the examples that Jen shared are things that are kind of, they're features and systems and kind of softwares that exist within these devices that have been built for one purpose and are just being used for a different purpose. So it's not the fact that these perpetrators are taking something and completely changing its what it's meant to do. Yes, okay, it's not meant to be used for that purpose, but it's still doing its function. And I think that sometimes we kind of forget that some of the, for example, if you use like location tracking devices, they sound great. You can put them in luggage, you can put them in, I know if you could put them, you could put them in your own children's bag if you're trying to watch that, figure out where their stuff is going. But it's also, well, if you're using that to monitor your partner, or if you're using that to monitor something else, then it's not the fact that you're taking these devices and changing what their purpose is. You're just doing it slightly differently. And I think what's a danger is kind of both underestimating perpetrators of it and overestimating perpetrators, that you're forgetting that it's these aspects that the way technology is developing, technology is meant to do what we want to do and just be able to work. We don't really like it if technology doesn't do what we want it to do. And so I think sometimes we just kind of, if it works, we're like, this is great. We don't question too many things about it. It's like with the example of, okay, well, a Ring doorbell, that's great. My doorbell works, this is great. But you don't necessarily think about, okay, well then what are the other cameras that it can add on? And I'm not aware of it because I'm not the person that's controlling it. So I think the way that technology is developing quickly is wonderful because there's so many new things that we can do. However, sometimes it's a perspective of the abuse that comes along with some of these devices is also developing just as quickly, but it's not always a proactive thing that we're acknowledging in it. Sometimes it's a reactive part of it, which then makes it more difficult. So in that aspect of is this getting easier and more simpler to perpetrate? In some aspects, yes, because there's more things you can do with technology, which is kind of how it's being perpetrated. But it's also not the fact that perpetrators are finding new ways to manipulate it in a way that it shouldn't necessarily be manipulated. It's more the former. And I think it's important to not kind of underestimate that aspect of they're doing what the function of the device is, but in a kind of manipulative way, or they're changing it in that way, which is important to consider, I think.
Absolutely. I think it is, you know, you've really acknowledged that, is that we are all concerned about safety and our own safety and the safety of our children, the people that we care about. So there is that line of, I want to know where you are all the time. And when does that then become, I am now going to that territory of you don't feel that you have any privacy or autonomy to decide or make decisions for yourself if you're in a relationship, for example. So I think it's key, because often you're right, Maddie, we think about the Internet of Things and we think that the perpetrators are slightly manipulating them, changing them, but actually if you take an AirTag, its sole purpose is to locate someone and find someone, and to be as small as possible so that nobody can find it when they're not supposed to find it. So yeah, and the same with Ring doorbells. You think of your own doorbell, but actually if your partner is very friendly with your neighbor who also has a Ring doorbell, he could easily say, or she could say, can I have a look at what's been happening at my front door? I think parcels have been taken. And in doing that and sharing that information across your neighborhood, for example, you're gaining additional stuff, but you're not misusing it, you're not manipulating it, you're using it for its all intents and purposes. I think that's really interesting. Thank you. So I suppose the other question is, you know, these things are everywhere in our everyday life. They are things that we use all the time. How can we, or what would be your sort of learning about how we create awareness about how they can be misused? Because there's awareness for those that are enduring abuse to be able to think about, for example, I also, you know, for all of us actually, for every single one of us, to think about, we also have autonomy over what's happening in our homes. We have passwords to the devices that actually we don't trust in the other people in the house to read the terms and conditions and understand things. So what would sort of your thoughts be around how can we, what should we be doing around that issue?
Sorry. It's a really good point, and it's one we need to be wary of. Awareness is a good thing. You know, No More Weeks is a great example of the need for awareness and the benefits that it can bring. I think we have a certain fear that actually widespread awareness campaigns, for example, could backfire, and we need to be quite open about that. In any activity that anyone on this call, where obviously this is a safe space with people who are really kind of engaging and trying to understand how they can tackle it, if this was something that you wanted to take action from following today in terms of, okay, how do we make people aware of this? How do we kind of spot the signs, really? You want to do that in a way which essentially is not going to educate perpetrators. So you don't want to be doing anything which is going to be going out there and saying, these are all of the ways that you could be abusing someone. You know, the point is to not inspire almost, and there is a risk of that, and we need to be really careful in any activity that we take in terms of building that awareness and making sure people are aware that it treads a really fine line in terms of the balance, that actually this is done in a delicate enough way that it's not going to inadvertently educate people on different kind of ways that they could use tech if they are not already committing or undertaking tech abuse. And that sometimes makes the awareness piece difficult, but it's not that we're not able to tackle it. And actually there's things that we can do within the community in terms of awareness, in terms of helping support services get the right information and advice, particularly for people who seek support. If you give an individual the wrong advice at the point of contact where they come to seek for help, it can massively increase the risk that they face. So for example, if someone comes to you and says, yeah, I think I've got stalkerware on my phone, and you look and you're proven correct, saying you need to delete that ASAP, wipe it off your phone so that, you know, nothing can be seen, may not necessarily be the best advice. It could trigger or alert the abuser or the perpetrator to the fact that they've been found out essentially in this aspect, and may put the individual at more risk. So in terms of giving advice and awareness, where there is a concern that an individual is being abused, particularly in domestic violence situations, absolutely, we would always say seek professional advice and support wherever possible. Some organisations in the UK, such as Refuge, have digital breakup tools and advice on how you can go through this. But more broadly, in terms of how we can tackle it, I think there's a wider piece which goes just beyond the awareness. Really, I think this is a social issue, because the behaviours are not new. This is just a new kind of extension of how people can do it. Putting that to one side for a moment, there are solutions that we can look at through tech in terms of safety by design principles, which could overcome some of these issues. So we've spoken about earlier, and inadvertently, I think said Ring, we're not picking on Ring, we should say video doorbell platforms, how additional cameras can be added, and users on that network may not necessarily know, and therefore could stay unaware that they're being monitored or watched in other rooms of their house, for example. If there was a simple alert built in when a new camera is added to every user who is on that system, they would be aware. If you had spyware or stalkerware, which you could not hide in the settings of someone's phone, at the moment there are ways in which you might be able to do that. If you protected yourself against that, perhaps that would be harder. If there were default pop-ups, which would say, did you realize you are still connected to these devices? You're still connected to these devices in your previous home. So an iPad you may have logged in on previously, for example, or a tablet, I should say, if I'm debranding everything, in your previous home that the abuser may have access to. If you're still logged in to a number of apps there, they could be tracking your activity. You may still, you know, your password may not necessarily have changed. Do you want to disconnect from these devices? So I think wherever possible, building in safety by design principles and making it really easy for people. We do not by nature value much more than we do convenience, and reading pages and pages of terms and conditions, or trying to figure out, particularly if you're not that tech savvy, how you can overcome these issues is really difficult. So we have to make it easy for people. We have to make it regular. We have to make it by default. A lot of the kind of tips and tricks that we see people using in terms of combating fraud could be quite helpful. So where we might have a pop-up saying you've just logged in this area to your account, was this you? Can you confirm yes or no? Those kind of things could be equally introduced in terms of general everyday kit, so that you can see, actually, no, that wasn't me. I did not realize I was still connected to that. I need to withdraw from it. I need to change my password. You know, and it can help the individual. But without wanting to layer another element on here, what we don't propose is too much kind of awareness or action, which puts the onus on the individual to change what they're doing. From a protection point of view, when there is a clear need to make sure that they're not at increased risk and that they're protecting themselves and their family, absolutely. But generally, we do not feel that victims and survivors should be forced off of online spaces and have to change their behaviour when they are the victim. The onus should always be on the perpetrator, and where there is a clear case and clear kind of mode of action that can be taken forward in terms of saying the perpetrator is held to account or charged or whatever it may be, to stop actually committing the crime in the first place, that always has to be the first preference. So a slight disclaimer there, that where we're talking around how people can be aware and can kind of protect themselves, that is part of the conversation, yes, but we absolutely don't think the onus should be back on women and girls to protect themselves solely, you know, and they shouldn't be in any way discouraged from using certain types of tech, being in online spaces, being able to use forums, being able to have a social media page, those things that make you able to participate in the world that we live in, where you are connected everywhere all the time. They shouldn't be forced away from that. So any kind of awareness or advice or support that someone has, I think should have that kind of clarity in mind. You have not done anything wrong here, and you having to change some of your behaviour is therefore not always the right thing to do. Sometimes it can help protect you and is right, but you don't want to force someone off of online spaces forever.
Absolutely. So I think you've said something really important there, is that we all, every single one of us, should be able to do a level of digital maintenance and have the ability through all of the devices and everything we sign to online to be able to check where our passwords are. I mean, I'm sure all of us have sat there and gone, let me check that all my passwords are connected to my right email address, and then gone, that's a task for another day, because that's too big a task. So I think you're right. There is something about, as a society, as rethinking about how we enjoy all of this convenience and passwords. I did meet somebody who was a data risk specialist, and he said something that was really poignant in the fact that we don't share each other, you know, we don't share toothbrushes, so why are we sharing our passwords? And if someone's asking you to share a password, consider that as like a red flag. But the challenge always is that when you start to meet someone, you enter into those early stages of a friendship or even a relationship, you're more willing to share information with each other. And often that comes, you know, you're asked for this information in a not straightforward way. Sometimes it's through manipulative behavior or coercive controlling, or sometimes it's I care about you so much, I want to help you. And so it feels right to hand over this information. So it's under a level of disguise to some degree. So I think you're right. There is something about the onus sitting on definitely on the devices and the tech companies. But you also mentioned, and I think this is something we've heard throughout the whole day, and everybody that we've spoken to, is that the advocate services, the victim, the ones that the survivor finds support with, the victim-led services, they have a huge task on their hands, in that they're dealing with with all levels of risk, in addition to now thinking about tech and how's that being used. So, you know, if you're moving into a women's refuge, the priority is often, are you here with your children? Are you physically safe? And then let's start thinking about tech, and let's start thinking about unpicking it. Staff members are, they change roles. The keeping up to date with the learning of stuff is very difficult because of funding and that type of thing with regards to training. So there's this pressure in a way, and the fact that we need to be a step ahead as advocates, but we also very much rely on other services that come into contact with survivors, like our police or other first type of responders. How can we encourage them to know what to do and how to do it? And what do you think would be the very first thing we could ask them to do?
Yeah. Do you want me to, or do you want to?
Oh, you can go.
I don't mind. I feel like I'm talking too much. What we've advocated for quite some time, and we'd be really keen to see in the UK, essentially, is a national support service which supports organisations to do that. It's a massive issue. We work really closely with a number of frontline domestic abuse and domestic violence organisations, and our work is approached in a way where we're closely linked to the sector. They are already expected, as you've quite rightly said, to be experts in housing, in social services, in emergency support that individual would need, mental health breakdowns, immigration, a number of issues. It's an incredibly tough, complex role. Yeah. And now you want them to be tech experts as well. I mean, but at the same time, if we don't tackle that tech angle, a lot of those efforts could be undermined. So where as you've rightly just said, the initial priority could be to make sure that person is, or that family, are moved to a safe location. That's going to be entirely undermined if you've not done a kind of tech risk assessment at the very beginning, because if they have location tracking services on, or they're still logged into apps which will be showing their location to the perpetrator, you're completely undermining that good work. So it has to be a central consideration. And a lot of this tech is not complex. The most common thing that people are doing is through phones and smartphones. Everyone's got one. This is not niche. This is not something that's happening in just a few % of cases. This is happening in the overwhelming majority of cases. And actually, the Susie Lamplugh Trust in the UK, who are a stalking organisation, say that this is tech abuse is a factor in 100% of the cases that they deal with. So in terms of the importance of factoring it in early, we cannot overstate it enough, but equally we cannot expect that to fall on the shoulders of the sector, particularly when we all know that tech is absolutely going through another revolution at the moment. We've had instances heavily profiled in the UK at the moment in terms of AI, deep fakes, what that means. Is this a new risk vector? How do we respond to it? And we cannot expect that to fall on the shoulder of the sector. We have brilliant minds in the UK and around the world of people who know tech inside out, will understand the functionality, what can be done, can't be done, have their ear to the ground around certain solutions, and could be given some really strong advice. And what we are really passionate about and would like to see in the UK is some kind of national kind of closed door to frontline services help centre, where you could escalate certain cases where there's clearly more complex tech abuse or it's more extreme, or you could get advice if it's emerging or surfacing in a way which you've never seen before. So if there's, you know, AirTags being abused in a particular way, or a new type of app or software and you're not sure how to deal with it, that you can get tech expertise straight away, including on that specific case. And there's some really good examples, for example, in the States of tech abuse clinics where they'll help.
One's out of Canal Tech, isn't it?
Yeah, has joined from there. So we're lucky to have him with direct experience working in that type of area. And that's another example, you know, where the tech sector have kind of stepped up and actually, you know, offered to kind of support the domestic violence and grassroots sector more broadly, which is fantastic to see. So that's something we would like formalised. We think that it shouldn't be kind of optional or, you know, a postcode lottery. If you live in certain areas that you have access to this, we strongly believe it should be a national service, which is kind of centralised. This is not going away. This is how we live now. It's just par for the course. And actually, if you're not understanding this or getting the right advice or support in how to deal with it, you're taking the risk for that individual from there to there. And this isn't a myth. You know, we've seen this in real life cases. Too many, in fact.
No, you're so right, because when we think about resources, there are few, but actually how much things change, and the model that's coming from sort of the East Coast of the US is working. You know, 2 sessions ago we had Lindsay Song, and she's from the Family Justice Centre in Queens, and she was advocating very much so that, you know, that whoever walks through their door, the Pacific support they're receiving, they'll escalate it to Cornell University, Cornell Tech's, you know, lab, and how effective that is, because more people can access support. That support is tailored, and it still enables that person to receive the advocate support that they're used to, but also the specialist support around tech abuse. So I think, yeah, we agree that that's really a great way forward. I think the other piece that's sort of always emerging is that the experiences are very similar across the world, but actually how they're experienced can depend on community and culture. And are you seeing that in your research as well, that different communities, different cultures are experiencing different, you know, the similar type of abuse, but it's being perpetrated in different ways and having a different impact?
I think, yeah, sure. I think one thing, this is something we actually found when we were looking at in our research study recently, is that to what degree, I guess, sometimes we're considering how these different norms around the world will impact it. Because I think, for example, if you consider, if you posted a picture of a woman online, you'd be like, okay, it's not great if you don't know the woman. However, if you posted a picture of a woman who, for example, normally would be wearing a hijab, but she didn't have it on, the implications and the impact it has on that person are different a little bit. I think that because it has that, one of the things that we have found when in our study recently is that, yes, there's some areas that people are like, okay, I'm not sure whether this should impact how we define tech abuse, but one of the most important things people agree on is how it impacts the victim survivor or the person that's being affected by this, how it impacts them and how they perceive what has happened to them is one of these main important factors. Because like we said earlier, is that we can't always put kind of the pressure on them to do something, but they need to be able to say, okay, this is how it's impacting me, this is how I feel about it, so this is what is happening. And I think there are some elements of it of being different around the world, because you can't, the level of technology that is used around the world is different, and the different smart devices or the Internet of Things devices that are available around the world are slightly different. So I think that there is this slight change between different groups and different communities, and having that. And also there is the impact of what are the resources available to you in your like immediate area, which in any form of resource, not, for example, if you consider education, there's also that impact of, okay, how can I be educated on this? Is you're impacted by what's in your kind of immediate area, which isn't great, which is why what would be wonderful is when there's these things like a national kind of way to help this. But there are always going to be, I think, or we're trying not to, but there are some slight differences between how these things are being perpetrated between different groups and different communities, and how these are impacting people as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that sort of resonated a lot today was the fact that a lot of the tools and resources that are available by, either by tech companies or by other things are very much focused on one group's experience. So take, for example, if you're going to flag abusive language online, you're often looking for one language. You're not necessarily looking at the context in which it's given or slang, or if that abuse is perpetrated with a number of different languages, that platform won't necessarily pick it up, and then the onus then falls on the individual to persuade the platform to respond. Whereas we need these safety tools, which are often machine generated, to be really considering the lived experience of survivors and listening in a way. And I suppose that takes us to sort of the overall message, and a little bit into our next session, about the importance of your study, the work that you're doing, and survivors' experiences, and that merging with the developers at the early stages about how we can create and form products that are safer. And you alluded to a little bit earlier on about, those small things that they can do. How are you working with tech companies to inform them of your research, your findings rather?
Do you want to? We'll do two parts.
I keep asking both of you because you're sitting in the same space. Each of you.
You make an excellent point around language. The global Delphi study that we're conducting, or towards the end of conducting at the moment, did take that into account. So we've looked not only at common slang terms, which were kind of open to be included, as well as formal technology, but also what the common definitions were for different types of tech abuse, and tech abuse as a header amongst different languages. So it does go down to that detail. In terms of our liaison with tech organisations and tech companies, some are really proactive. I hope they wouldn't mind the shout out, but tech organisations like Kaspersky and Fujitsu really open to engaging on this, and I think should get the props for being as proactive as they are, for being open to tackling these kinds of challenges. And not to direct quote them, but have said, yeah, this is a really complex issue because it's so woven into the fabric of everyday life. And actually these are basic pieces of kit that you can't layer with too many types of security. But also we've got really clever people working on these kind of things, and this is not so much of a mountain that we can't crack it. So yes, it's an issue, yes, it's widespread, yes, we know it's causing huge implications. What on earth do we do about it, given that it's kind of basic tech that we're all used to using? No one wants to kind of make their piece of kit more expensive, harder to use, less convenient, because that directly impacts the consumer, is going to impact the design or how intuitive it can be. It doesn't have to compromise any of that. I think sometimes there's an assumption that it would have that downside, and that actually when we work with tech companies, that what we're saying in terms of building in privacy and ensuring safety by design principles are taken into account, that it would have those negative connotations. Doesn't have to be the way. What we're saying is, this is how it's surfacing, your product is being manipulated. We feel they have a duty, if anything, to add on that. Tech are not the bad guys. Some are not doing all they should be, it's fair to say, but we're not here to bash the tech industry. I've just said lots of them are doing brilliant things, and we work closely with a number of those organisations. We've released a paper recently on safety by design principles for IoT, which I hope is in the resources that we can share afterwards. If not, we'll reshare it. But I think the one thing we're sometimes wary of with the tech perspective is that there is a natural inclination, understandably, to find a tech solution. So I can create a new piece of kit or wearable or app which can protect against the problem that is occurring from original said piece of kit or app, what have you. So you almost layer in an additional problem. That the ultimate kind of buffer that we're up against is that a lot of these devices were not introduced with, as Maddie articulated really well, the original objective of being able to be manipulated in such a way, and people find a way to do it. So sometimes layering on something else doesn't always help. So for example, we've seen victim survivors advised to have location tracking devices so that they feel assured that someone can see where they are at all times, and actually that can be really helpful in certain circumstances. If you're absolutely, you've got some confidence and some assurance that the right people have got access to that, that that it can't be hacked, it's not logged into anything else, that it's not presenting you with a new risk vector. So some tech is good and some of the players are good. So I don't want this to have felt like a tech bashing thing, but we need to acknowledge, I think, that sometimes tech solutions aren't the whole picture, that this is a societal problem and the crime itself is not new. The controlling and coercive behaviour, that piece we've touched on around awareness, actually understanding that this is really unhealthy, nipping it in the bud, challenging these kind of societal stereotypes where, particularly with the younger generation, are so used to living in each other's lives online, that is normalised, and it shouldn't be. And as long as that continues to be normalised and tech continues to evolve at the pace it does, this problem is only going to get worse. Over to you.
I think one of the things as well is that with, for example, the tech aspect of it and thinking, oh, well, is there a tech solution to this? Whenever whether it's in tech or in a different something we're working on, we never think, okay, well, what is going to be, well, we don't often think what is going to be the worst case scenario with this. And I think sometimes it's that aspect of having to think, like the safety by design principles, it's having to think, how could this be used? And how we want it to be used is one thing, but it's having those in mind to try and be proactive about it rather than having to be reactive. Because if we're having to be reactive, that means someone's been negatively impacted by it in the first place, which is then a difficult aspect to deal with anyway, because it's impacting a person, it's impacting people, but it's still something we're trying to get in front of rather than trying to constantly catch up these developments in technology. I think that's a really important point to think about, is that, okay, sometimes it is a case of what do we think someone could do with this to try and stop that. And what...
So I suppose it's inviting survivors and advocates and NGOs into the room at the point of development to try and unpick and trying to think. And like you said, there are some tech companies that do it phenomenally, and there's great open communication, and they're completely engaged with, in a way, sort of understanding their product from a 360-degree perspective, and that's when it makes a difference. We only have a little bit of time left, and I just want to really go back to a point that you both made, and I think I'd really like to spend a minute with, if that's okay, is about that immediate jerk sort of response that we do if someone is experiencing tech abuse or is experiencing online harm, is that we'll tell them to get rid of all of their devices, disengage completely, and how that can really, in a way, be completely disempowering and, like you say, very importantly, putting them at more risk. What is your research sort of talk about that? And what would be your suggestion if you are a friend or a family member or a fellow professional who experiences a disclosure? What is the best thing to say to somebody in that moment? Two big questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to I think the first thing to be aware of is that they're very unlikely to say to you, I am a victim of tech abuse. Even within the field, we've worked in it for some time, articulating something as tech abuse is not always easy. And then actually when you're looking at what tech abuse can be, it's a really broad group. So we focus today within this session around IoT devices and kind of everyday kit and how that's manipulated and how that often surfaces. We know that there are massive issues in terms of gender-based violence with economic abuse, with financial abuse, for violence against women and girls. There's a huge interplay there. We haven't touched that much around some of the online vectors today, where we focus more on the IoT side. So a lot of the things we see around intimate image abuse, for example, is a more commonly known, particularly in the UK, phenomenon, I guess you'd refer to it as is kind of trolling or abuse on social media, because it's been relatively high profile in the UK in recent years, and rightly so. So I think for some instances, it's easier to articulate that something wrong has happened because we've been able to articulate the problem and that we've had the national conversation about it. It should not just be individuals who are able to fall into that clear category that are able to kind of legitimize and surface their problem or feel able to, because people understand the concept and understand what's happening, when actually this goes so much broader. So I think a lot of this is around recognizing that actually the pattern of behavior is wrong, and tech is probably just one way in which that is surfacing. And if I would say that person is in a controlling or coercive relationship with clearly abusive behaviours, there is a likelihood that there is a tech element or involvement, and it may be worth having the conversation to say, have you considered, you know, what links there might be from a technical perspective? I mentioned Refuge's digital breakup tool and other devices. So there are some resources out there. We would never want to advocate not seeking professional help and support for the reasons outlined earlier. But I think having the conversation confidentially and as sensitively as you can to kind of articulate that situation for the individual would be one of the key places to start. But the truth is, there is no easy answer to that question. I hope that's not too black and white.
No, that's perfect. I'll come back to you, and I just want to say exactly what you said, is that, you know, we've got helplines across the world whom are thinking about risk, and, you know, experiencing online harm or abuse or tech abuse is part of their red flags, what they're looking for, and being able to, they may not be able to solve the nitty-gritty of it, but they'll be able to help you and support you in identifying it. You've got the global directory, you've got refuge helpline if you're in the UK, and the hotline if you're in the US, and other parts of the world equally have great centers. So I'm going to move on to you, Maddie.
I think one thing that is really important is, we've kind of touched on it as well, is the awareness aspect of it, or the awareness aspect without kind of educating perpetrators. I think we're in a world that is so connected that the idea of, okay, can be one thing. Of Jen touched on the fact that, okay, it could be online things as well. It's the idea that someone could be abusing you online, someone you never know. There's also that element of, okay, but you're kind of, some aspects of this, the online parts of it are kind of normalized now, as we're like, oh, someone being mean to me online, okay, but when does it go from someone just being mean to you online to, well, they can contact you any time of the day, because 99% of us have our phone on us most of the day. And I think it's important to raise the awareness of, if we're in that situation of a friend or a colleague or someone we know, we think could be in that situation, it's making sure that we're aware that, okay, some of these behaviors, you might have a friend who always has their location on anyway because they want to do that and they've consented to doing that. But it's acknowledging that actually sometimes people don't consent to doing that, and it's being aware that some of these things may be okay to some people but maybe aren't to others. And I guess there's a worry of, if we normalize a lot of the tech activities that we have, it's, well, how can we recognize when it's actually not okay? Because like Jen said, it's probably hard to recognize it for yourself, and it's also not good to say, okay, well, get rid of the devices, because in this world that's all connected, you're just isolating that person. And also, if then the perpetrator gets hold of their new device, what happens to it then? It hasn't actually solved the problem. So I think it's important to remember to be aware of it and know that not all of these behaviors are like normal and
I'll just add on the behavioural norms point, just to wrap up. I know we're out of time, but I think there are steps we can all take in our everyday life around calling out behavioural norms which are a bit distorted, and that doesn't necessarily have to be in a kind of one-on-one situation. But I've had friends who've entered into relationships, their first long-term relationship, head over heels, and why on earth wouldn't I at that stage let him have my password to my phone, or I don't think anything wrong about him looking at my phone when I leave the thing. And, you know, this love bombing, I get 300 messages a day because he loves me so much, until all of a sudden you've done nothing wrong actually, but accept some slight thing to irritate him, and that's it, it switches off and you have a complete breakdown over it. Oh, they haven't done anything wrong in that situation. Well, actually, do you think that's normal? And do you think that's healthy?
I think you're absolutely right.
And it's for that reason I know some people do. I've openly said, had the conversation with my children, I won't track their location. Sometimes when the 18-year-old is not home, I wish I could check the location without ringing him in the early hours of the morning. But I don't want that to be a normalized behavior, that actually we live in each other's lives, and that's completely fine, because as they grow up and develop into relationships, it normalizes how you live in people's online spaces. And if something does go wrong, where's your protection? Where's your kind of layer of being able to remove yourself? And that's where it begins to become
I'm certainly going to have to say, call to close this brilliant conversation. I know this conversation, so many people are interested in and want to carry on learning more, and we will share all of your resources. Thank you both so much for joining us today and sharing so much. And I think the key takeaway in this, in some senses, is that, you know, a survivor, someone who's enduring domestic abuse, will always tell the person close to them in probably the most obscure way. And the better we can listen without judgment and respond with, you know, that there is specialist support out there, but take your time and not place blame, could be make all the difference. But thank you both so much. You've been so insightful, and we've learned so much. And I can see from all the questions that have come on and the team have answered that we want more time with you. So I will come back to you. Hopefully we can invite you back onto one of our other sessions, because your research is brilliant and we're really looking forward to hearing more. So thank you very much from the No More team, and for everyone who's been listening, thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.